we're going to talk about a really special book, a special book for me, particularly, which we published a while back, a novel by Ifat Nawaz. Ifat Nawaz is a Bangladeshi-American writer, and Shujo's Clan, her first novel, goes back to the aftermath of the Bangladesh Liberation War, actually, and looks at the generation that that was born in a completely new nation that was born from bloodshed, and looking at the people who survived the war, who grew up in a nation full of hope, but also full of grief. It's a beautiful novel, and I know the title of our session, Grief and Strange Things, is rather grim, but I can say that despite all, if its novel is about loss, it is about displacement, it is about grief, but there's also a lightness to it which is so refreshing and which is so unusual for a novel which deals with these immense emotional subjects. I just wanted to, I would really love for you to read from the novel, but maybe we can hold out for a while, because I really want everyone to get a feel of what the book is about. But before that, I wanted to ask you, Shurjo, the protagonist of the novel, was not a witness to the Bangladesh Liberation War. She was a generation that grew up, that was born after that, and much the same as you, and so I would really like to hear from you what it was like for your generation to live in a country that's just been born, and because all of that led to your writing of the novel. So.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you for believing in the book. You're behind it, seeing the light of day. So basically, I get asked this question a lot, although you didn't ask me this question, how much of Shurjo's Clan is autobiographical? And I always say 25%, because it can be, it can be taken very much like a memoir. But it's a story that of the generation that was born after the war. I was born in 78, and I think kids born in the 70s, after 71 war, had a very different, sort of pie that we were a part of than the ones who were born in the 80s and 90s. Our parents just had, they were all part, every family was a part of this war. Every family had lost somebody or, fought in the war. Everybody had a stake in it. And the whole reason for the war was obviously our culture, Bangla, being the main thing, Bangladesh, And so religion was not, in the forefront ever. We were taught to be as secular. We were taught the language in a way, the culture in a way. At the same time, after the war, the celebration was so great that we wanted to take away the shadows of the trauma that was also very alive. It's a small place. And, there were deaths everywhere, in every street. In Dhaka University, there were this horrible massacre that had happened. Different parts of the country saw different kind of atrocities. There were many, many women who were raped. There were many war children. So this was all around as well. So the shadows of the dead were very alive. And they were celebrated like they were already living. So there was this magical element about it. But we weren't told these things as a sad story. We were told these things as stories of heroes and stories of victory. So, in that sort of way, we looked at bloodshed, we looked at the war, we looked at our history as something to be proud of, but at the same time, in a human level, in a child's eyes, we would there were shocks. We were given books we shouldn't have been reading and images we shouldn't have been seeing of how they were killed, and all of this. But we were so sort of it was so prevalent that we also didn't question our parents' judgment. And at the same time, we were also given things that were beautiful. And I was telling you yesterday, to learn the culture, there was the 21 February is our the International Mother Language Day. We had given blood for Bangla. So there was a celebration where we would all come out of our house bare feet with flowers and walk to the monument where people had given their lives for it. Or the first day of the New Year, of Bengali New Year, we all again walked to a tree like this actually and sang Tagore songs from 4:30. So there was all this. So there was a very interesting sort of mix of things, but we did not see the shadows as much because our parents were too close to the forest to understand what had happened to them and how much trauma they were carrying. Instead of telling us about that, they gave us all of this, like just infused it, which became like a magic realism kind of thing in our minds, which is why I think the only way I could write this was also magic realism. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting because I think even in my first reading of the book, before I even knew you, before I had even spoken to you ever before, I felt, as you mentioned, it's almost a memoir, it's part memoir, so I did feel that, and I think the strength of the emotion comes out so strongly, in the book, but at the same time, it's a novel, and I was wondering in the writing of the novel, there are two questions here. One, how were you able to distance yourself from what you experienced, because the novel came from that, to fictionalize it, and do you think the best of writing really comes from these deeply felt experiences?
I'll answer the second one first. Absolutely. I think the more deeply we feel something, there are layers of it. So it's, the surface level pain first, and then you go in, and because you can't let it go. It won't leave you. So you really have to pierce through to figure out what is it. And you think you've let it go, and then it comes back again. So yes, I think that process itself changes you, and then therefore the writing becomes more personal. So and meaningful to you. So hopefully the reader also feels the same when they're reading it. As for the first part of the question about how do you distance yourself, so for me, I didn't. My first draft was very different, absolutely a different book than this. It was very heavy. I realized I had, I was carrying a lot of conditioning. So there were, there's an enemy in my head of, maybe a nation did this to us, or we were taught this. And so when I was writing the stories, they were more like baggage and burden and caused by a certain, like the other side, And and while I wrote it, and I wrote so much, it was a much longer first draft than this book. And so it was as if like I had to just get all the angst out and all of the anger, like all of the sadness and all of the sort of even grievances towards family members or things I didn't understand about our culture and our patriotism that is a lot in Bangladesh. And so there's a lot of criticism, and I don't want to use the word negativity, but honesty in a way that was maybe a little more pessimistic. And therefore, it became another war story and another book of grievances, a darker book. And when I had finished, I was living in Pondicherry at this time, and Pondicherry is a very calm place. If you have been there, it's very subtle. You don't even feel like wearing red or magenta, because it's so subtle, you feel like you're going to pop out of it, So people are very sort of calm. And in that environment, with all my angst and all of this, when I was writing this book, which felt so important to tell the story of, I just suddenly, it felt like a contrast. And once I finished the first draft, it was like, simplify this. Do you really need to push it like this? There are books like this. What are the things you really want to talk about? And then I froze for like almost a year to figure that out. And then I felt like a fraud, that I wasn't a writer at all, and trying to approach this in different way, and it wasn't working. And then during COVID, one of the things that came to me was, before COVID actually, that the main character had to turn towards light, to remind me that I had to turn this towards a lighter way of speaking about it. Otherwise, it will not happen, like it will not be a different book. And also for my own processing and own healing, the word is too used, I know, but still, it had to be that. So when I'm writing it, her name is Shurjamukhi, which means sunflower, and sunflower needs light. So she always has to look at light. So anytime the book was getting heavy, a chapter became something different, similar to my last draft, I would have to rethink the direction I was going, and that I couldn't just look at the abyss, and I had to look up. So that process itself made it more fiction and taught me things that I had to learn. And yeah.
No, it's interesting that you speak of the first draft, which I'm now dying to read to see how much it has changed, because it seems like a completely different novel that you had initially written, and the name Shurjamukhi as well. Shurjo, the protagonist, I believe the protagonist was not Shurjo earlier. I mean, the name wasn't Shurjo. So did a Shurjo exist in the first draft at all? Okay. All right. Yeah. I think part of one of the reasons for writing you also speak of the question of healing. That a nation that needs to heal to move forward. And it seems that writing the novel was also a part of a healing process for you. So I just want to, in the novel, when we start the novel, the entire Shurjo and her entire family, so there is just to give you a sense of it, there is a known world and an unknown world. Shurjo's family during the day exists in the reality as it exists now, but in the unknown world, the family which has passed on, her uncles who were martyred, they come back to be with them during the evening. Shurjo's maternal grandmother, who had to during partition, they had to flee from Murshidabad and come here, and she couldn't cope with that loss of her home. And as a result, she died. She committed suicide. She would return to the family. So it would be a large family gathering in the evening, which is full of joy, which is full of storytelling, which is full of singing. So it's a family which lives a lot in the past and is not able to let go of that past. I think that healing process is complex, where you can't stay in the past entirely. You need to also let go of it to be able to move forward. So what is this burden of memories that exists? What is it like? And how does one move forward? Is it an act of forgetting?
Wow. So few things. One, I think inheritance of grief, like we inherit grief, all the immaterial things we inherit, people give, our parents give us properties and things we can hold on to, assets, but then they give it with love. That's why it's an inheritance. And inheritance of grief is also with love, because there's that inheritance is always, I think, has a bit of care in that word. It's not the curse of grief, right? So we take it in as something we have to carry, and then it becomes a burden after a while. First, it's an identity. I think that's what it was for people like me. That this is who I am. This is what I'm told to be. And then eventually when you're growing up and you're a teenager, and then suddenly you start questioning things and getting bored of the same lecture you were seeing on television. The Bangladesh television used to have similar songs and things going on, and all very patriotic. You see that the freedom fighters have become more political and leaning left or right ways that they shouldn't. And all of that, so you start questioning it, and that's when you realize that what is my politics, and what, is this a burden? Then what am I saying? And then I think I walked away from that. Living in the US, it gave me the opportunity to sort of separate myself. And people in the country who still live there, they also separated themselves as we grew. And it kind of festered in different manner for us, our generation. And, I was talking to you about this incident that I might mention again about how this burden, what it can become. So Bangladesh, and like many other countries who are young still, I mean it's 50-something, but still young, have this tendency of giving us the Kool-Aid, and we drank it very well, and it tasted good for us. But then it became staler and staler with time. So the kids who were born in the 90s and later got a different version of it. By then, the country was, the politics was really not nasty. People fighting, we had lots of strikes, and then at the same time we were told, oh, this is the country we should be proud of, only nation this, only nation who had done this and done that, and then the kids don't believe it, right? Because it's like, well, that's not what I'm seeing. And a result of this burden that they were handed, there was an incident in 2016 in a kind of poshy bakery in Bangladesh in July 1st of 2016, where 5 kids had left, they were 18-year-olds, they had left and joined ISIS and came back, Bangladeshis, and killed the people who were there that night, including some of the Bangladeshis who wouldn't recite the kalma, to prove they were Muslim. And one of my friend was there who didn't, and she was killed. And it was the biggest shock for our generation and everybody, that how come the same, they grew up in the same soil as us, and we love our soil. So where did we miss out? And then we realized that we were just giving them the shadows and as stories, and the joy of it had left a long time ago. So the burden is the only thing they had inherited. And this is the result of that. And we missed it somewhere. So that was also an inspiration behind writing this book, because I wanted to connect with the younger generation without telling the story again and again. They can Google stuff, and they already know it. So how do I make that burden lighter and not quiz them or challenge them? And so that they are actually the main audience for the book, because I don't want, I don't have children, but I think this is the way I would want to connect with the younger crowd. So yeah, and forgetting, I don't think we can forget, but I think we can sort of move forward and let it do its thing without us going back to water it.
Do you think I think it might be a good time for you to read a little bit from the novel?
So I'll read the first few paragraphs. So each chapter is called something else, and this one is called 1.5. When Surjamukhi was young, her family lived in an asymmetrical house that held 2 parallel worlds. They resided in both, with their steps following a specific rhythm to walk in and out of these dual realities. The house was built during the British era and stood in an old part of Dhaka called Ganderia. It was originally called Grand Area, but the tongue of time had robbed the name of its luxury, turning it into gibberish. In addition to the first and second floors, Surjamukhi's house also had rooms on the 1.5 and 2.5 floors. The family's heirlooms, memories, and secrets were stored in those in-betweens. Surjo's bedroom was on floor 1.5, a landing that had been made into a small room. Her parents slept on the second floor and grandparents on the first. Surjo was put there because she could not decide which set of adults she wanted to spend her nights with. They had humored her and come up with this in-between solution. This put Surjo at an equal distance from the 2 couples and closest to the treasures of her family's past. During the day, Shujo's family abided by the same world that most people lived in. After dark, when everyone was back home and the century-old wooden front gate had been locked, they switched to the other side. Death did not exist on the evening side, and additional family members joined the dinner table. Surjamukhi's uncles, who had been martyred in the country's liberation war, fought over the best piece of fish. Her father comfortably slipped into the position of the middle child, freed of his daytime role as the head of the household, the sole living child of his parents. Shujo was either completely ignored or overwhelmingly doted on by her visiting uncles and her maternal grandmother, who usually showed up after dinner to chew her betel leaf in the company of Shujo's mother. In the day side of the world, she had killed herself by jumping into a well. Shujo's family called the day side known and the evening one unknown. They rarely asked questions in the evening side, comfortable with what they did not know. In the day side, however, everything had to be clear, precise, found out, even though it was ironically the more secretive of the two worlds. Surjamukhi was forbidden to speak about the unknown side to her friends at school. This was a real inconvenience since the best stories were told in the evenings by those whom the known world had declared dead. Shujo wanted to talk about the games her family played, about the trunks they opened to look at old wedding saris and sherwanis that could turn into dust on the palms of their hands at any moment. She knew more stories about the war and migration than any of her classmates. She aced her history exams and could give impromptu speeches on the 1905 partition of Bengal, the 1947 partition of India, and the 1971 liberation war of Bangladesh. Her teachers thought she was gifted, but Shujo was only repeating the stories she had heard firsthand in the unknown world. Unable to tell anyone how she knew so much, she stayed shut, becoming awkward, fidgety, and unnaturally reserved.
Thanks so much. That was really lovely. I just wanted to ask you a bit about the form, the style of the book, So there is a lot of magic realism, and as you said, from the first draft to this, you simplified it immensely. Just wanted to understand, that art of creating the novel in your head, and why did you choose this particular style of?
So, in terms of the magic realism, or?
Absolutely.
Okay. I don't think I could have told it any other way, and there's a bit of occultism that goes hand in hand with Bengal. And we believe in these things from very early on. We're told stories of the other world a lot. And old homes always held these sort of who used to live here, what happened to them, And, between that, in a twilight time, what happens, who crawls in under the, this and that. And, as children, we were like, yes. And then at the same time, we heard the stories of the dead so much, so we would connect the two. Oh, maybe they look like this, who lived here, and maybe that story looked, so it's very visual, and people who are visual will immediately create those worlds. So I think that world was already inside from very early on, and I think with magic realism, it gives you the freedom to detach also. It becomes fiction, so that personal and the fiction becomes more clear, because nobody's going to believe this happened in the known and unknown world. So it was a perfect way to express what I felt without making it too real. And so that was the reason why the magic realism came, and I couldn't have done it without magic realism, because the Dhaka I grew in was magic. And then the second part of there are three sections to the book. The first part is all in Old Town Dhaka, and a bit in India and Murshidabad. And then the second is in the US. And all the magic leaves when when Shujo goes to US with her parents. And I thought, it was not intentional at all, but I also migrated to the US when I was a teenager. And, I think it just gives you so much space that magic couldn't exist in that space. It was just too clear and like found out, it was too lit up. And the rhythm of the day didn't give you the pockets to imagine beyond what it was. It was spectacular and vast and beautiful, but it wasn't as magical. And I wanted to create that space in the book to also, for me to breathe and for the book to breathe, because I felt like it was a lot in the first section and the book had to sort of process in the middle, with still some things that happen that are intense, and then go back to maybe a little more intensity in the third section. So that was the logic.
No, I'm glad you brought up the other sections as well, because when you read the first section of the book, which is entirely Dhaka and Bangladesh, and you see it as a Bangladesh story. Then Shujo goes off to the US, and it does not remain a Bangladesh story. It becomes a more universal story. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about how the plot traveled outside, how the same you managed to connect everything that was happening?
Yes, because it was something I also noticed. So before leaving Bangladesh, it was like, this is our history, this is what we hold on to. I was in the 7th grade when I moved, and when I got there, my English I had to go to the English as a second language class for about 6 months. And this was 1990. So there were lots of kids from Afghanistan who had come due to the unrest that was going on. There were kids from Sri Lanka who had come, and then you realize that it wasn't just your story, it was like quite universal, and they also had their own stories, and some of them were actually much more grave than mine, because mine was like, I inherited it. They had seen things. So it was reflected back to me. Without the magic, but still it was like, oh, I am not so special, or my country is not the only one. So that I think and then there was the Vietnam War veterans who had gone mad, so many of them. We lived close to DC, and we would go to the monument, and there were people living on the streets, homeless, and or like speaking to themselves, not mentally well, completely unprocessed, emotions and things, giving speeches to nobody, things like that. And then you also saw, okay, another effect of war in a place like US was there. Later on, when I traveled, I went to Colombia or Nicaragua, saw similar things, there as well. Gabriela Garcia Marquez writes about it so much. And so all of that was there, and it felt like it was no longer just a Bangladesh thing, and it would do injustice to make it about that. And a place like US exposes that, those things, like just makes you sort of become more humble about, I think, your own like badge of whatever you're carrying, the hero's badge you're carrying. So that happened, and thanks to US, it happened.
I do want to open up for questions from the audience, but before that, just one more question. You speak a lot of times in the novel about the word you use is obiman, pride, pride in a new country, pride in belonging to a family of martyrs, but the sense of belonging was also, in a new Bangladesh, it was also a little complex. It wasn't as straightforward as all of us have sacrificed for this new nation. There were layers of it, and that layer also, one of those layers also came from those who had moved from West Bengal into the East. Could you speak a bit about that?
Sure. So my family is like 75% from West Bengal, Murshidabad, Medinapur, and Calcutta, and they had moved in between 47 and 1950. My paternal grandparents had switched homes, so they would have a place to stay with a Hindu family who lived in Old Town Dhaka. So they had homes. They could, kind of get equal share of what they had given up. But my maternal side didn't, and they were refugees. They were, they were like holding on, staying here until they had to rush out one day because everything was getting burnt. So, all of that happened, and of course it's huge, everything, it's tragic and all of that. But because you're in a new nation, and you're told that this is now your new home, the fear of being othered and holding on to what you have left, although of course they were, that was their world, really quickly they had to assimilate, change their accents, because West Bengal, East Bengal speak in different accents, a little slightly different, our vocab is a little different. All of that had to be switched very, very quickly. And in that process, we were, afraid of maybe talking about what we had left behind, or the journey, how traumatic it had been. People had lost people in that journey as well, but there are very few stories told about that. And so then, fast forward to 1971, by then there's enough assimilation. My uncles who were born in India, in Calcutta, were freedom fighters fighting for Bangladesh because they really believed in it, and they were Bangladeshis than anything else. But then fast forward to me, in school. So this is, in the new nation, and we are always flaunting that people go to their village homes for Eid and for puja and all of that, for festivals. And we are always asked, like the third, fourth question is always, where is your, village? I didn't have one. So first I would make up stuff, it was not true. And then I would say Dhaka, and Dhaka is not a village. So are you guys from Dhaka, Dhaka? Are your parents born in Dhaka? Yes. And these are like same age people, And then what about your grandparents? No. Where? India. Oh, you're a ghoti. And ghoti is basically like a pot, that people who were coming brought. All they could do when they were running away was to maybe pick up things, and maybe they carried this ghoti, a pot, to drink water. So your whole dignity was then summed up in that pot. It was a derogatory term that became humorous, but it's not nice. So I would get really upset as a child. So that was also very strange, that there was this layer, like even after losing family members, giving blood, my father was also a freedom fighter, I still couldn't be as Bangladeshi as there was this, maybe I was, but it was probably an insecurity that I don't have a village, okay, can I also claim it as much as you do? So that was there. And then even in that whole zone, no one talks about the Bihari population that lives in Bangladesh who had moved to East Pakistan because it was closer from Bihar. And during the war, they supported Pakistan. So now they're still, and Pakistan didn't want them back after 71. So there is this camp of the Bihari camp, which is absolutely sad, and nothing has been done about it. So it's interesting because those children born, they consider themselves Bangladeshi, but they're labeled as Biharis still. So it's a very complex thing. Yeah.
I'm quite intrigued, and these layers still exist. I can imagine the Bihari population, they would be, given their role in the war, it would be it would be not easy to brush off. But the partition has been, it's been a while, and there is a generation, as you spoke earlier, a generation which is younger than yours, which where memories are not intense. The passing on of memories are also not as intense as it was for you. So do these layers exist? Do you see it in this new generation as well?
It's taken a different form. It's not so much about the Ghoti and the Bangal. It's more about sort of like new money, old money, and unfortunately religion. Exactly the thing that we fought for. So, now we are measured by those things, which is another story.
I would really like to open it up to the audience now. So I hope there are lots of questions for Iffat.
Thanks for the great reading and the great questions and answers. I'm wondering about writing about place and writing about Bangladesh and America, and if you talked about the magical realism being different, but can you explain how you wrote about place, how you brought them to life on the page, if there's anything that you discovered about writing about those two different environments?
So, thank you, Sean. I think that we all take in place in different ways, and some of us are more sensitive to it than others, maybe. So, of course, something like we have more audience. Something like a place like Dhaka or places in India that are, very like unique. It's very immediate, the imprints that they make on you, right? And in terms of U.S., which is more like, you figure it out slowly and what. So before, I think, because I come from a family of migratory birds, is what I call it, going from one place to another. I used to have this habit of carrying things from places. They were like stones and soil and things I picked up, and then later on looking at it and like creating something with it, like personally, to remember a place. Until I realized from a lot of travel that I did on my own, that anyway I was getting imprinted by these places, and I didn't maybe have to remember or jot down so much as I thought I did. And so for me, I don't know how it works for others, so for me it felt like when I sat down to write, I just had to sort of travel back a little bit to create that space. And there were things that would be, that were like, if I did something in Dhaka that just didn't seem right, anyway, it just felt like, that's falsehood right there. That doesn't happen, or that didn't feel right. So I think I went with my senses, old senses that live with me, and sort of followed the heart to understand what felt more true, even in the language I was using, what felt more sort of appropriate to describe a place rather than not. Yeah, thank you.
Elizabeth, Ifat, great session, thank you. Couple of questions. Yeah. One is in connection with the healing process that you mentioned. So was Shujo's imaginary world or the unknown more like the invisible friend for you? Which you connect to move forward. And two, on something about being in the US. So I did study abroad in the UK, and the one thing that I noticed is no matter from where you are, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, when you come together and there's a sense of some sort of commonality, maybe in Hindi or maybe in Bengali, or even the food. Right, some similarity in the food that you eat, you kind of come together. You don't talk about any of these boundaries or any of these differences, yeah? And then it's just one happy huddle. So, and I keep wondering, why can't we do this when we go back home? Yeah, so, I mean, does that reflect somewhere in your journey as well? So these are the two questions.
Yes, so the invisible friend, the first question, yeah, to an extent, I think so. I think all of us did in that generation use that as an invisible friend. And also there was this, I think, but then the word friend is a bit confusing for me because we were told to respect them, right? So it was also like, almost like you bow down to this picture without, like you're like, can he be my friend, my uncle who hangs from the wall in the picture, like staring at me wherever I go, like I respect you. So I think only when so they were 30 and 23 when they both died together in Sylhet in the war. And only after I think I crossed their age is when I started looking them as like, hey buddies, So I think I had to wait till that point. So they were more like entities that I respected. But yeah, definitely actually more visible than invisible. They felt very potent in the house. As far as this comment about, yes, you're a Desi, I'm a Desi, kind of a thing. I talk about that a bit in the book. I don't go too much into it. So the parents of Shujo are like in an argument about this because they're saying that just because we speak the same language, and they're talking about Bangladeshis, not even would you have hung out with this person if you were in Bangladesh? The answer is no. So why are we then going to these parties in the weekends and creating a scene which becomes very much like an escape from the other reality of US, not assimilate, So I looked at it from that point because I went through that where I would go to parties for a while every weekend to eat like bhat dal and fish. And then eventually like, okay, what am I doing? The same songs being sang over and over again. We're talking about the same things over and over again. So it was interesting I lived in the US for about 18 years. So I think I went through different phases of that.
Lurking right wing or right wing ideas coming into power using religion is a common legacy of the Indian subcontinent. And in Bangladesh also you had the right wing coming into power, and they are still lurking around. What is your feedback on what is the impact on the religion, the extreme religion feeling in the Bangladeshi society? What's your take on that?
So I think this is an effort to I don't want to use the word battle, but to sort of my way of expressing that. So there's no mention of religion. There's no last name for any characters in this book. I took religion out of it. And I think it's not just me. There are many people like me in Bangladesh who feel the same way, where it's a secular nation, and we still believe it, even though it's not. It was changed during that fundamentalist period. There wasn't a fundamentalist government, but in the 80s, there was an influence of the fundamentalists when they came to a little bit more in power, Jamaat-e-Islam, which was kind of the beginning of this, the movement that we're still trying to get rid of. So yes, you're right. There is definitely more. We see a lot more religious symbols, people looking different than what we're used to. Less saris being worn, which is why a lot of us make a point of wearing more saris. But I think it's a phase, just like I think the whole world is going through a phase with this, not just Bangladesh or India, but beyond. And as long as we can speak from clarity of where we stand and how we want to see the place that it was, that we think we aspire to, there will always be a balance, and we have to wait and see where it goes. But I think there is enough counter power to fight it.
So firstly, Elizabeth and Ifat, very engaging conversation, thank you. Ifat, you mentioned that when you moved out of Bangladesh, in the daily rhythm of your life, you had lesser pockets to imagine beyond, which I found as a very beautiful expression. And I wanted to ask whether you think in a writer's immediate context, things like moments in daily life, maybe the landscapes, maybe certain other things that we experience in an immediate environment, do some of it lend itself as better writing material, or do some of those moments or experiences make better memories? And from your own writing and creative process, how do you respond to this particular question?
It's a beautiful question. Let me see if I can do justice to this. So I think we carry the well of what we have already that was sort of instilled earlier. But I think the moment to moment is really important. And I think I've noticed that whatever is in the forefront of my mind or heart, I've found clues in that day to, in that present moment, to maybe find words to explain it, or an image has shown up, or some random philosophy has entered me, or I've read something that resonates and actually talks exactly about the memory I'm thinking of, or taking me beyond that memory, maybe making me resolve something I've been working with. So I think you have these questions from the past or memories, and the answers are in the present. I don't know if that makes sense. Okay. To write the book, how long did it take? So the first draft took forever. I started in 2016. I was working as a humanitarian in different countries. It was a bit of a madness. And then, so from 2016 to 2018 is when I finished it. It took a long time. This one was 9 months, just like a child. Yeah. Yeah.
I had one actually, and we started with talking about the book coming out of your personal experience, of course. So much of it, and as I said, I saw you in Shurju. Now it could easily have been written as a memoir, so I'm curious as to the decision to fictionalize it. Was there ever a thought of writing it purely as a memoir?
No, because I don't have so much clarity, I think, to write a memoir. I think I would be way more biased and I would hide things. I don't think I'm courageous enough to write a memoir. And I'd probably make statements which I myself won't believe in a couple of years down the line. And a lot of people, and things would come in it because you have to be truthful. That would maybe make it a little more loaded than maybe I wanted it to be, because I had to choose maybe 3 things I wanted to focus on as a theme, not everything, because there are so many other battles to sort of face. So I think fiction gave me I could prioritize, okay, these are the 2 or 3 things I want to pass forward. If it was a memoir, I'd be so all over the place. I think I'd get lost in its weight. And I don't know if it would be as light also, so yeah.
No, thanks a lot, Iffat. I would urge everyone to read Shujo's Clan. I read it again this week to have a conversation with Iffat, and I was so happy to have done that, to return to the novel. So I hope you all get the same joy from it that I did. And thank you for being in such a great engaged audience. And thanks, Iffat, for being here.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for making this book happen. And I met Elizabeth for the first time yesterday, and we have been working with the book for 2 years. She's my editor. And so, and I'm so happy to be here and talk about Shujo and all. And each conversation is different, and this was definitely one of the ones I'll remember. So thank you. Thank you so much.